Battlefield 6 is releasing this year, and with that in mind I thought to ask the question, what's the best Battlefield map ever made? It's a tough one to answer really, isn't it? Arguably impossible. What about top 5 of all time? Still pretty hard. You'd have to cut out a lot of great maps, just think about it. BF 1942, BF2, 3, 4, 5, Bad Company, BC2, 2142, BF1. There are loads of games to choose maps from. Instead, what if I asked you to name your top 10 maps of all time? I think that sounds a bit more reasonable to me, and so that's what I've done here. Now if we all did this, we'd have incredibly different lists. The truth is that everyone is different, and everyone not only prefers different maps, but has different memories of playing them. A lot of maps that I've chosen are because I remember them so fondly when playing with friends. I've had great experiences on them. It absolutely affects your decision, but when you're cutting down so many maps to only 10, tough choices have to be made, and I've made a few today. So the first in my top 10, and in absolutely no order, is Strike at Karkand. We'll find this out numerous times during this video, but the sign of a popular map has to be how many times it gets remade over the years, and Strike at Karkand has had its fair share of remakes. It was made in BF3, even 2142, but the version that I'm choosing here is from Battlefield 2. I still think Karkand is one of the best examples of infantry combat in an urban environment that Battlefield has ever created, and it's only when I jumped back in to run around that I remembered just how big this map was. It's got more capture points across the bridge than the BF3 version too, which does make a difference if one team gets pushed back. The one downside I'll say though is that it's really dusty, which can impact vision. I think that was due to performance at the time though. I'd love to see Karkand reimagined again in another modern Battlefield game. The BF3 version looked incredible, but look at this concept image and imagine it with an up-to-date Frostbite engine. It could be epic. Next up we have another huge map. Battlefield 2 maps were rarely small to be fair, and here is Dragon Valley. This is another BF2 map of course, but it was also remade in BF4. This one was a tough one because the BF4 version of the map looks fantastic, and it feels way more like what the original map designers would have envisioned if they had the tech back in BF2 days. The temple area especially looks gorgeous. It's also the map that had one of the most frustrating Easter eggs on it ever, with switches hidden in trees, logic puzzles and all for a dice camo. Even still, the original map has fonder memories for me because it was just such a great Battlefield experience. Jets, choppers, tanks, infantry, the map just flowed really well. I spent many hours as a chopper gunner on this map, and for that reason, it's on my list. Next up, arguably one of the most iconic Battlefield maps of all time, Wake Island. This may not come as a shock for you, as I imagine it will be on a lot of people's lists. And we talked about remakes being a measure of how good a map is. Well, this map has been remade more times than I can count. The original version was released on BF 1942, and that's the version that I've picked. So many good memories from playing BF 1942 on here. It has been remade several times though, on BF2, BF3, BF5, Vietnam, 1943, 2142, and even Battlefield Heroes. It's a very popular map. What's so interesting about Wake though is that it was also the demo map for BF 1942. Battlefield as we know it is a huge 64-player all-out war experience, but back then it was a brand new concept and it had to be proven. In fact, during an interview with Lars Gustafsson, the big man at DICE, before the release of the BF5 version, he explained how at the time the studio was struggling to pitch the game to publishers because they just didn't believe a game like that could be made. And so Wake Island ended up being one of the central points of the trailer and the demo. So if you think about it, it really is where Battlefield as we know started. And it has to be on my list for that reason alone. Let's switch gears though and now move on to a more modern map. Just like Wake Island was the centerpiece of BF 1942, whenever I think of Battlefield 3, I immediately jump to Caspian Border in my mind, and it's the next map on my list. It was remade in BF4, but despite the map being reasonably similar, minus a huge wall, I just feel as though the original played better, had a great flow to it, and it just brought some better memories for me. It was the first glimpse that we got of BF3 multiplayer as well, and that trailer was just incredible. It had everything that you could want from a Battlefield map. Infantry battles, especially on the hill, space for tanks, lanes, choppers raining down hell, and jets fighting way up in the sky. The layout wasn't very complex, but it just worked as a map, and often some of the best maps in these games are the simplest. And my next map is from Bad Company 2, and it's none other than Arica Harbour. This is another infantry map, and I'd say it's one of the better maps in BC2. Unlike some maps though, I actually enjoyed this one on both Rush and Conquest, and the BC2 destruction definitely adds to the experience. Over the course of a round, you'll find most of the buildings destroyed, and while you'll get killed from the odd player hiding inside them, it does offer a unique experience. You can use all classes to good effect here too. Perhaps the only issue with the map is snipers sitting really far back during rush matches, but apart from an artillery strike, we can't do much about that now, can we? And then we have another Bad Company 2 map, but this time a rush specialist, Valparaiso. I think this one would be up there for a lot of people, but likewise it could be a bit Marmite for others. I personally think this is one of the best rush maps in the game, perhaps of all time. And this was definitely one of the most played maps for me on Bad Company 2, so I remember it more fondly than most. The various stages are so different as well. You've got to push down the hill, then you fight through the fishing village before working your way back up another hill. I imagine loads of people will remember sniping from the lighthouse too. Moving on, it's time to head all the way back to BF 1942 again and El Alamein. This is another map on my list, despite being, well, really it's just a big open desert, but back in the day when I loaded up BF 1942, it was so iconic. And I asked myself, why did I like this map so much? If a map came out like this today with so little cover, I'd definitely be criticizing it, and yet I remember El Alamein so fondly. Back in BF 1942 times, there weren't all that many assets on the maps to begin with, so it wasn't that much of an issue back then. And each team's base was at the opposite side of a huge mountain or hill, and then 2 outposts sat on either side. And this was definitely a vehicle-heavy map, and it showcased that element of Battlefield to the maximum. Tanks and planes are the order of the day. Infantry, well, you probably won't have a very good time here. And while infantry may not have had a good time on El Alamein, somewhere they did prosper was on Grand Bazaar, and that's next on my list. This one could maybe be classed as controversial, but it's on my list because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, mainly good memories. I played this map more than I could remember. I love the infantry flow through the middle of the map, and also the banana, as we used to call it. Back when BF3 was the main game, I played a lot of competitive games, and we played matches on this map quite a lot. It worked really well for 5v5, which is unusual for most Battlefield maps, and that's one of the reasons that it's on my top 10 list. Just a fun map to play, generally warm up on, had vehicles there too, loved Grand Bazaar, and some of you may even remember the remake in Battlefield Hardline. It even had a secret room that led you to an epic Easter egg that in terms of spectacle was one of my favourites. And for our penultimate map, we have our first Battlefield 1 map, and to me, St. Quentin Scar is at the top of the list for BF1. I do think there are some good BF1 maps, but this one just has a fantastic flow. The flow between the flags, mainly the ruins down to the town, just works great. Of course, the overpowered bombers during various phases of the game's life didn't exactly add to the experience, but the tanks and horses worked in relative harmony here. Some fantastic sniping opportunities from the windmill and the windows of buildings too. And this map also happens to be part of a BF1 operation, and the first few points that you have to capture offer up a fantastic trench-based battle. It's BF1 at its World War I fantasy finest. Ironically, the first part of the operations map isn't used all that much during Conquest, it's basically a gimme flag, but in Grand Ops it was a fantastic experience. And last but by no means least, I've got to put Propaganda in my top 10 from Battlefield 4. On paper this map looks incredibly linear and basic, but in actual fact had a brilliant flow to it, and it's one of my favourite infantry experiences in BF4. It was added with the Dragon's Teeth DLC, so interestingly it's not even a base map. That should tell you how much I personally like it for it to get into my list. It's a built-up urban map set in North Korea, and you've got one side of the map which is mostly a heavy urban area with lots of factories and a giant monument. Then on the other side of the road and tracks, you've got 2 other flags. Interestingly, there's also a Levolution event on this map where the train rolls through the map. Be careful not to be in its path when it does, because it will kill you. One thing you may not know though is that this map was based on a level from BF 2142 called Belgrade. While the concept of each of these maps isn't the same, and those games are vastly different, you can see similar design in the layouts, and it's a nice nod to 2142. A couple of cool Easter eggs on this map as well. And there we have it. That's all. My top 10 most iconic, bestest, greatest, most fabulous Battlefield maps of all time. And speaking of BF 2142, I don't have any maps in my list, despite enjoying that game. I just don't think any of them were particularly epic and stand out. It's the same with Battlefield 5 for me, although a couple came close. I mentioned it before too, but this is just my personal list based on my experiences with all of those games, but I'd be really interested to find out what you guys think and which maps are your favourite across all games and why. What makes the best Battlefield map of all time? Let me know down in the comments below. And that's all guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more and I'll see you